The ocean doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't leave witnesses. It doesn't preserve evidence. And in the isolated coastal towns that cling to the edge of North America, from the frozen harbors of Alaska to the fog-choked piers of Massachusetts, the water is always watching. Tonight, we're investigating 7 unresolved crimes from the most remote, unforgiving waterfronts on the continent. These aren't random tragedies. These are cases where the environment itself became complicit in erasing the truth, where isolation, silence, and the vast cold emptiness of the sea turned answers into ghosts. You won't find these stories in national headlines. Most have been buried in local police archives, dismissed as accidents, or left to rot in the salt air alongside the evidence that was never recovered. But the strangest part, in every single case, something doesn't fit. A timeline that's impossible. A witness who saw too much. A victim who vanished from a space where disappearing should have been impossible. This is Plain Sight Docs. And this is 7 cold coastal towns. The North Atlantic and Pacific mysteries the sea keeps. The last shift at the fish pier, the unsettling absence in Gloucester's. Mark Delaney was 24 years old when he disappeared. He wasn't a transient. He wasn't a drifter passing through. Mark was a deckhand on the Salty Dog, a commercial fishing trawler operating out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, one of the oldest and busiest fishing ports on the North Atlantic. He'd been working that boat for 2 years. He knew the docks. He knew the routine. He knew the people. On the night of April 14th, 2015, Mark finished his shift at 1:45 a.m. The work was typical. Cleaning nets, hosing down the deck, securing equipment for the next morning's departure. The Salty Dog was scheduled to leave at 5 a.m. for a week-long run to the Georges Bank fishing grounds. Mark clocked out. He said goodnight to the boat's captain, who was reviewing manifests in the wheelhouse. He walked off Pier 12, heading toward the gravel parking lot adjacent to the old fish processing plant, where his truck was parked. Security footage from a single grainy camera mounted on the side of the processing plant shows Mark walking across the lot at 1:52 a.m. He's alone. His gait is steady. There's no indication of distress. He walks toward the section of the lot where his truck is parked, into the darkness beyond the range of the camera's weak infrared field. And then, nothing. Mark Delaney was never seen again. His truck was still there the next morning, parked exactly where he'd left it. The keys were found on the driver's seat. His wallet was in the glove compartment. His phone was on the passenger side floor, battery dead, but Mark was gone. The initial investigative theory was straightforward. Mark had slipped and fallen into the harbor. Gloucester's docks are notoriously dangerous at night. Wet planks, poor lighting, deep water. The harbor at that section of Pier 12 drops off to a depth of nearly 40 feet. The water temperature in mid-April hovers around 43 degrees Fahrenheit. A fall into water that cold in the dark is almost always fatal within minutes. But there was a problem. Mark's truck was parked away from the water's edge, at least 60 feet from the nearest dock line. To fall in, he would have had to walk back toward the pier in the opposite direction of his vehicle, for no apparent reason. Investigators brought in deep-sea sonar within 12 hours of his disappearance. They swept the harbor floor around Pier 12 and the adjacent docking areas. They found nothing. No body. No clothing. No evidence of Mark Delaney at all. The search expanded over the following days. Divers were deployed. The tidal patterns were analyzed to determine if a body could have drifted. The Coast Guard conducted surface sweeps extending miles out into Massachusetts Bay. Still nothing. Pier 12 is not a tourist destination. It's a working dock. The wooden planks are slick with seawater and fish residue. The air smells like brine and diesel. At 2 a.m., it's almost completely dark. Just a few weak sodium lamps spaced far apart casting sickly yellow pools of light that do almost nothing to cut through the fog that rolls in from the open Atlantic. The fish processing plant that borders the parking lot is a long, low concrete structure. Its refrigeration units hum constantly. A low, mechanical drone that's the only sound in the dead hours of the early morning. The building has rusted vents and narrow, fogged-over windows. It's functional, not maintained. During the day, workers move in and out, processing the catch from dozens of boats. But at night, it's deserted. The machinery keeps running, but the building is dark and empty. The gravel lot itself is pitted and uneven. Potholes fill with rainwater and reflect the weak light from above. A high chain-link fence borders the lot on the inland side, separating it from a residential neighborhood that's been in decline for decades. The fence is old, sagging in places, topped with rusted barbed wire that hasn't been replaced in years. You might wonder why a 24-year-old deckhand would be targeted for anything. Mark wasn't involved in drugs. He had no criminal record. He wasn't in debt. He had a girlfriend, a small apartment in town, and plans to move up to a boat captain position within a few years. By all accounts, he was reliable, well-liked, and stayed out of trouble. But investigators started asking a different question. There are no security patrols. The single camera, the one that captured Mark walking into the darkness, was installed years earlier after a series of vehicle break-ins. It covers only a narrow field of view. The rest of the lot is a blind spot. But the water, the harbor water at night, is something else entirely. It's deep black, choppy, reflecting only the occasional weak navigation light from boats moored further out. The cold salt spray hangs in the air, coating everything with a thin layer of moisture. Visibility in the fog can drop to less than 10 feet in seconds. Sound is muffled. The crash of waves against the pilings becomes a dull, rhythmic thud. The environment swallows everything. This is the environment Mark Delaney walked into, and then vanished from. What if Mark saw something he wasn't supposed to? The Salty Dog was scheduled to depart early that morning. But Gloucester's docks, like most working ports, have a reputation for more than just fish. The town has a long documented history of smuggling. First rum during Prohibition, then narcotics in the 1980s and 90s, and more recently, questions about untaxed cargo being moved through smaller, independent vessels. The fog on the night of April 14th was particularly heavy. Visibility was near zero. The docks were deserted, except for the handful of boats preparing for early departures. The conditions were perfect for moving something quietly, without scrutiny. If someone was loading or unloading something illicit onto a boat in the early morning hours, they would have wanted complete privacy. They would have wanted the fog. They would have wanted silence. And they wouldn't have wanted a deckhand walking across the lot at 1:52 a.m. But here's the part that makes this case one of the most baffling on the North Atlantic coast. There is no physical evidence of violence. No blood. No scuff marks. No signs of a struggle. The security footage shows Mark walking calmly. His truck was undisturbed. His belongings were left behind. If someone abducted Mark Delaney, or worse, they did it with such speed and efficiency that it left no trace. Not on the gravel. Not on the dock. Not in the water. That level of control suggests planning. It suggests knowledge of the area. It suggests someone who knew Mark's routine, knew when he'd be alone, and knew exactly how to remove him without leaving evidence behind. The alternative, that Mark simply slipped into the harbor in the 60 feet between his truck and the water's edge, in the opposite direction of where he was walking, requires believing in a series of improbable decisions and an ocean floor that somehow consumed his body completely, despite immediate sonar deployment. Neither explanation holds up under scrutiny. Investigators conducted over 30 interviews in the days following Mark's disappearance. They spoke to the crew of the Salty Dog. They spoke to other boat workers who were on the docks that night. They spoke to residents in the neighborhood adjacent to the parking lot. Almost everyone had the same response. They didn't see anything. They didn't hear anything. But a few people, speaking off the record, suggested that the docks at night weren't a place you wanted to be asking too many questions. One former deckhand, who'd worked Gloucester for 15 years before moving to Maine, told investigators, "If you're smart, you finish your work and you leave. You don't hang around. You don't look too close at what other boats are doing. That's how you stay safe." When pressed, he wouldn't elaborate. Another worker, a diesel mechanic who serviced boats at Pier 12, mentioned that in the weeks before Mark disappeared, there had been an unusual amount of activity around the docks late at night. Boats coming and going at odd hours. Trucks parked in areas they normally wouldn't be. He described it as off, but not something he felt comfortable reporting. "You report something like that and people remember," he said. "This is a small community. You don't make waves." Mark's family has never accepted the drowning theory. His mother, Linda Delaney, has been vocal in local media, pushing for the case to remain open and for investigators to treat it as a potential homicide, rather than an accidental death. In a 2018 interview with a Gloucester newspaper, she said, "My son was not careless. He worked on boats his whole life. He grew up on the water. He knew how to be safe. And even if he somehow slipped and fell, where is his body?" The harbor was searched immediately. The tides were analyzed. They found nothing. You don't just disappear into thin air. She's right. Bodies in harbors, even in cold water, typically surface within days due to decomposition gases. The currents in Gloucester Harbor are well documented. If Mark had fallen in near Pier 12, his body should have been recoverable, either immediately or within a predictable drift pattern. But the ocean gave back nothing. The case remains open. Mark Delaney's family still lives in Gloucester. His mother has given multiple interviews over the years, always returning to the same point. He was walking to his truck. He was going home. Why would he go anywhere else? Investigators have never publicly named a suspect. The boat captain who saw Mark last passed a polygraph dot. The crew of the Salty Dog were all accounted for at the time of his disappearance. But the dock master at Pier 12, who retired 3 years after Mark vanished, gave an off-the-record statement to a local journalist in 2019. He said, "There's things that move through here at night that people don't talk about. Everyone knows the rules. You don't see nothing. You don't say nothing. Mark was a good kid, but maybe he was in the wrong place at the wrong time and somebody made sure he wouldn't talk about it." The journalist followed up, asking what Mark might have seen. The dock master refused to elaborate. He died in 2021. Whatever he knew, he took with him. So, what really happened to Mark Delaney? The forensic reality is this: his body was never recovered. No evidence of foul play was ever documented. But the circumstances, his truck, his belongings, the timing, the fog, the location, paint a picture of something far more deliberate than an accidental drowning. If Mark was removed intentionally, the method was professional. The speed suggests prior knowledge. The lack of evidence suggests experience. The location suggests someone who knew the docks intimately, who knew the camera's blind spots, who knew the timing of security rounds, who knew how to move in the dark without being seen. And the silence from the people who work those docks every day suggests that maybe, just maybe, someone knows exactly what happened, but they're not talking. Because in places like Gloucester, survival depends on knowing when to look the other way, on understanding that some questions don't have safe answers, on accepting that the ocean keeps its secrets. And so, it seems, does everyone else. The impossible timeline at the New Bedford docks. Samuel Kincaid, everyone called him Sammy, was 58 years old when he was murdered. It happened on the night of November 11, 1996, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. New Bedford is one of the oldest deep-sea fishing ports in the United States. Once the whaling capital of the world. Now, it's a labyrinth of docks, lobster boats and trawlers, crammed side by side in a harbor bordered by decaying Victorian buildings and narrow, cobblestone streets. Sammy was a boat mechanic. He ran a small workshop adjacent to the docks, a single-story corrugated metal shack crammed with tools, engine parts, and decades of diesel and brine stains. The interior smelled permanently of oil and salt water. The concrete floor was stained black from years of leaks and spills. A single overhead fluorescent light flickered constantly, casting harsh shadows across the cramped workspace. He worked alone, mostly on contract for smaller independent fishing operations that couldn't afford the bigger marine repair shops. Sammy was known as reliable, affordable, and discreet. He didn't ask questions. He fixed engines, patched hulls, and kept boats running. He'd been doing it for over 30 years. On the night of November 11th, Sammy was found dead inside his workshop at approximately 4:30 a.m. by a worker arriving early to prep a boat for departure. He had been beaten to death with a heavy blunt object, likely a metal wrench or pipe. The attack was brutal. Forensic analysis suggested multiple blows to the head and upper body. The murder occurred sometime between 2:45 a.m. and 3:15 a.m., based on body temperature and rigor mortis progression. But the murder itself isn't the mystery. The mystery is how the killer left. New Bedford's docks at night are not heavily trafficked, but they're not completely deserted either. Boats come and go at odd hours. Workers show up for early shifts. Security personnel make rounds. The commercial wharf where Sammy's workshop was located is a controlled access area. There's a gate, a guardhouse, and a single road in and out. On the night Sammy was killed, 2 separate credible witnesses gave statements to police. The first witness was a security guard named Raymond Torres. He was contracted to patrol the dock area and was stationed near the entrance to the commercial wharf where Sammy's workshop was located. Torres had been working security on the New Bedford docks for 8 years. He was former Coast Guard, experienced with vessel identification, and known for being thorough with his log entries. At approximately 3 a.m., Torres reported seeing a lobster boat, a vessel he identified as the Sea Witch, pulling out of its slip rapidly and heading east, out toward the open water. He noted the time specifically because it struck him as unusual. Most boats don't leave in the middle of the night unless they're trying to beat weather or catch a specific tide window. Neither condition applied on the night of November 11th. Torres described the boat's movement as fast and deliberate. He said the engine was loud, louder than normal for a vessel leaving port. He watched it disappear into the darkness of the harbor, heading toward the mouth of the bay. He documented the sighting in his logbook, noting the time as 3:00 a.m. and adding a remark: Sea Witch departed. Unusual hours. But here's where the case fractures. The second witness was a newspaper delivery driver named Alan Prosser. His route took him along the waterfront every morning, and he passed directly by the docks at 3:20 am, 20 minutes after Torres claimed to have seen the Sea Witch leave. Prosser gave a statement to police saying that he saw the Sea Witch tied securely at its slip at 3:20 a.m. He specifically remembered it because the boat's name is painted in large, white letters on the hull, and he passed within 15 feet of it while making a delivery to a nearby dockside office. He described the boat as dark and stationary. No lights, no engine noise, no movement. The boat was tied with its standard mooring lines, bow and stern, exactly as it would be if it hadn't moved all night. Prosser had been running the same delivery route for 6 years. He knew the docks. He knew the boats. He knew the timing of his stops down to the minute, because he had over 40 deliveries to make before dawn. So which witness was telling the truth? Investigators initially assumed one of them was mistaken. Maybe Torres misidentified the boat. Maybe Prosser got the time wrong. Maybe the fog, which was present but not heavy that night, played tricks on someone's perception. But both men were adamant. Torres was a former Coast Guard officer with years of experience identifying vessels. He knew the Sea Witch. It docked at that wharf regularly. He'd seen it hundreds of times. He was certain. Prosser had been running the same delivery route for 6 years. He passed the Sea Witch's slip every single morning. He knew what the boat looked like. He knew where it was moored. He was certain. Both men passed polygraph examinations. Both men stood by their statements. So investigators were left with a timeline that shouldn't be possible. 3 a.m. the Sea Witch is seen leaving the harbor, heading east into open water. 3:20 a.m. the Sea Witch is seen tied securely at its slip stationary, dark and silent. That's a 20-minute window. For the boat to have left at 3 a.m. and returned by 3:20 a.m., it would have had to travel out into open water and then immediately turn around and redock. A maneuver that makes no sense for a working fishing vessel and would have been extremely difficult to execute in complete darkness without navigation lights, especially at the speed that would have been required. But if the boat never left, if Prosser was correct, then what did Torres see? The workshop where Sammy was killed sits less than 200 feet from the slip where the Sea Witch was moored. The timing is impossible to ignore. Sammy was murdered between 2:45 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. The Sea Witch was either leaving or not leaving, depending on which witness you believe. Right in the middle of that window. Investigators interviewed the boat's owner, a man named Carl Dennison. Dennison had owned the Sea Witch for 12 years and used it for lobster trapping along the Massachusetts coast. He was 51 years old, had no criminal record, and was well known in the New Bedford fishing community. He stated that the boat had been docked and unused on the night of November 11th. He claimed he was home asleep and had no reason to take the boat out in the middle of the night. He said the last time he'd used the vessel was 2 days prior, on November 9th, and that it had been securely moored since then. Dennison also passed a polygraph. His alibi, that he was home with his wife, was corroborated. Phone records showed no unusual activity. There was no physical evidence tying him to Sammy's murder. But here's what makes this case deeply unsettling. Forensic investigators found traces of Sammy's blood, not inside the workshop where he was killed, but on the dock planks near the Sea Witch's slip. Not a lot. Just a few small droplets, consistent with transfer, like someone stepping in blood and then walking across the dock. The blood trail led from the direction of Sammy's workshop toward the water. It stopped at the edge of the slip where the Sea Witch was moored. The working theory, never officially confirmed, is that Sammy was killed by someone who knew him, knew his routine, and had access to the docks. Sammy's workshop was not locked. The door was found open when his body was discovered. He was known to work late, often alone, especially when a repair was time-sensitive. He was approachable, trusting. If someone knocked on his door at 3:00 a.m. claiming they had a boat emergency, he would have let them in without hesitation. But the murder was not a robbery. Sammy's wallet was still in his jacket, containing over $200 in cash. The cash box in his workshop, where he kept payments from clients, was untouched, with nearly $800 inside. Expensive tools, including a new torque wrench set and a marine GPS unit, were left behind. So, what was the motive? Investigators began looking into Sammy's recent work. In the weeks leading up to his death, he'd been contracted to do engine work on several boats, including the Sea Witch. He'd also been asking questions, informal but persistent, about irregularities he'd noticed in some of the boats he serviced. Specifically, he'd mentioned to a friend that he'd found hidden compartments in the hull of one vessel, modifications that didn't make sense for a working lobster boat. Compartments designed to hide cargo. Compartments that had been professionally installed, reinforced, and sealed. He didn't say which boat. He never filed a formal report. But people talk. And in a place like New Bedford, where the docks are controlled by entrenched local networks with long memories and strict codes of silence, asking the wrong questions can be dangerous. The docks at night are a specific kind of environment. The boats are tied side by side, their masts swaying slightly, the rigging clanging rhythmically against the metal in the cutting wind that whips off the open water. The sound is constant, metallic, percussive, echoing across the empty wharves. The buildings overlooking the waterfront are old, Victorian-era brick structures, many of them abandoned or converted into low-rent storage. The streets are narrow and dark. Streetlights are sparse. The smell is a mixture of brine, diesel fuel, and fish. The air is cold and damp, heavy with moisture. The water laps constantly against the hulls and pilings, a wet, rhythmic slapping that's the only other sound besides the wind and the rigging. The atmosphere is one of total isolation, even though you're surrounded by structures and vessels. The darkness swallows sound. The water is deep and black, reflecting nothing. The fog, when it rolls in, turns the entire area into a disorienting maze where you can see only a few feet in any direction. At 3 a.m., you could commit a crime on those docks, and the only witnesses would be the boats themselves. So what happened to Sammy Kincaid? The forensic evidence suggests he was murdered by someone who knew the area intimately. The blood trail suggests his body, or evidence from his body, was moved toward the water. The location of the blood droplets near the Sea Witch's slip suggests the killer either used the boat, tried to use the boat, or wanted investigators to think the boat was involved. But the conflicting witness statements make it impossible to know how that plan unfolded. If Torres was right, the boat left at 3 a.m., possibly with the killer aboard, possibly with evidence that needed to disappear into the Atlantic. If that's true, then the killer had access to the boat, knew how to operate it, and was willing to take an enormous risk by moving it in the middle of the night, immediately after committing a murder. If Prosser was right, the boat never left, meaning the killer was still on the docks, still in the area, when the newspaper driver passed by at 3:20 a.m. then. If that's true, then the killer either moved on foot, by vehicle, or went to ground somewhere nearby, waiting for the heat to pass. Both scenarios are disturbing. Both suggest a level of calculated risk and familiarity with the docks that points to someone local. Someone who knew when the security guard made his rounds. Someone who knew when the delivery drivers came through. Someone who knew the Sea Witch and its owner well enough to involve it, or stage its involvement in the murder. But then, something unexpected surfaced. In 2003, 7 years after Sammy's murder, a retired fisherman named Gerald Poole came forward with new information. Poole had worked the New Bedford docks for decades and had known both Sammy and Carl Dennison personally. Poole told investigators that in the months before Sammy was killed, there had been tension between Sammy and a group of boat owners, Dennison included, over unpaid bills. But more than that, Poole claimed Sammy had confided in him that he'd discovered something disturbing during a routine hull repair on the Sea Witch. According to Poole, Sammy had found a hidden compartment that contained what he described as military-grade waterproof containers. He didn't open them, but he knew what they implied. Poole urged Sammy to report it. Sammy refused, saying he didn't want to get involved. But he also said he couldn't unknow what he'd seen. Poole's statement was investigated, but no physical evidence was ever recovered to support his claim. The Sea Witch had been sold in 1999 and was no longer accessible for forensic examination. The new owner had made extensive modifications, including replacing large sections of the hull. Carl Dennison, the boat's owner, was never charged. He maintained his innocence until his death in 2014. In his final years, he gave an interview to a local maritime history project, in which he briefly mentioned Sammy's murder. He said, "Sammy was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened. But he was also naive. He thought the docks were just about fish. They're not. They never have been. When asked what he meant, Dennison ended the interview. Raymond Torres, the security guard, retired in 2005. He has repeatedly stated in interviews that he knows what he saw. He saw the Sea Witch leave the harbor at 3 a.m. on the night Sammy Kincaid was murdered. He has never wavered. In a 2010 interview, he said, "I don't care what anyone else says. I was there, I saw it. That boat left and 20 minutes later, they're telling me it was still tied up. That doesn't make sense, but I know what I saw." Alan Prosser, the delivery driver, still works in New Bedford. He has given only one interview, in 2008, in which he said, "I know what I saw. That boat was tied up. I walked right past it. If somebody's saying it left, then either they're lying or there's something I don't understand. But I'm telling the truth. The case remains unsolved. But this much is certain. Sammy Kincaid was murdered. His blood was found leading toward the water. And a boat that two credible witnesses cannot agree on became the central, unresolved contradiction in a case that has haunted New Bedford for nearly 30 years. At this point, you're likely asking, how is it possible that both witnesses are telling the truth? The answer is it shouldn't be. But the evidence suggests they are. Torres saw a boat leave. Prosser saw a boat stay. Both passed polygraphs. Both had clear, unobstructed views. Both had credible reasons to remember what they saw. So either one of them is lying, despite all evidence to the contrary, or something far stranger happened on the New Bedford docks on the night of November 11th, 1996. Something that defies the timeline. Something that suggests either a level of coordination and deception far beyond what investigators initially considered, or a mistake so profound that it fractured the entire investigation. And that impossibility is what keeps this case cold. Because in the end, the truth depends on a 20-minute window that shouldn't exist. And no one, not the investigators, not the witnesses, not the people who knew Sammy, can explain it. The lighthouse keeper's last log. A vanishing on the remote island. The logbook entry was routine. October 19th, 1985. 9:15 p.m. Clear skies. Light wind from the southwest. Fuel levels normal. Everything at Ocracoke Light Station was exactly as it should be. 2 days later, the lighthouse was dark. For the first time in over a century, the Ocracoke Light, a beacon that had guided vessels through the treacherous waters off the North Carolina coast since 1823, had gone silent. When the supply ferry arrived on October 21st, the crew knew immediately something was wrong. A dark lighthouse doesn't just happen. It means failure. It means emergency. It means someone isn't doing their job. Or someone can't. The crew docked and made their way up the narrow path to the keeper's quarters. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was undisturbed. The bed was neatly made. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen table, a thin film of mold growing on the surface. But Elias Thorne, the 47-year-old lighthouse keeper who'd maintained this isolated station for 6 years, was gone. The only thing missing was his heavy weather rain slicker. Everything else, his wallet, his keys, his identification, even a packed emergency duffel bag, was still there. Ocracoke Island is not a place where you disappear by accident. It's a narrow barrier island in the Outer Banks, 16 miles long and less than a mile wide at most points, accessible only by ferry. Population, under 1,000. Everyone knows everyone. A stranger gets noticed. A missing person gets found. Unless the island doesn't want you found. The search began immediately. The terrain around the lighthouse is unforgiving. Shifting sand dunes, dense maritime forest, brackish marshland that floods with the tide. The island is bordered on one side by the Atlantic Ocean and on the other, by Pamlico Sound, a vast, shallow expanse of water that stretches for miles. Search teams swept the dunes. They combed the beaches. They sent dogs into the maritime forest and helicopters over the marshes. They searched for 5 days. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no footprints, no sign that Elias Thorne had ever left the station. But he was gone, and the lighthouse was dark. Investigators did what investigators do. They looked for answers in the victim's behavior, and they found something unsettling. Elias kept meticulous logs every day. Weather conditions, fuel consumption, maintenance tasks, passing ships. He documented everything. For 6 years, his entries were textbook perfect, professional, concise, factual. But starting in late September, about 3 weeks before he vanished, the logs changed. September 28th, heard footsteps on the spiral staircase at approximately 2:30 a.m. Investigated. Found nothing. Wind was calm. No explanation. October 3rd again, footsteps on the staircase. This time closer to the lamp room. Checked all doors. All secure. No one present. October 10th, saw a light moving on the keeper's walk at 4 a.m. Too high for a person standing on the ground. Too low for a boat signal. Observed for 10 minutes. Light extinguished suddenly. No source identified. The entries escalated. They became more detailed, more paranoid. October 15th. I am certain someone has been entering the station at night. I hear them. I see evidence. Doors left ajar, tools moved, but I never see anyone. I have begun locking all interior doors. I am sleeping lightly. And then, on October 19th, the night he disappeared, Elias made his final entry. It was purely factual, almost artificially calm. No mention of footsteps, no mention of lights, just weather data and fuel levels, as if nothing was wrong, as if he'd accepted something. The investigation had 2 directions to pursue. The first was psychological breakdown. Isolation does things to people. Lighthouse keeping, especially in remote postings like Ocracoke, has a documented history of breaking even experienced men. The repetitive routine, the lack of human contact, the endless nights alone in a tower surrounded by darkness and water. The paranoia Elias documented could have been the early stages of a complete mental collapse. If he'd suffered a break, he might have walked out into the dunes in a confused or delusional state. The terrain is treacherous. The marshland is riddled with soft mud and deep channels. A disoriented man could become trapped, could drown, could be consumed by the landscape in hours. But there was a problem. If Elias had left in a state of psychological collapse, why did he take only his rain slicker? Why was the door left unlocked but not forced? Why was everything else in perfect order? A man in the grip of a mental break doesn't exhibit that level of organization. The second theory was darker. What if the footsteps were real? Ocracoke Island has a long documented history of smuggling. During Prohibition, it was a drop point for rum runners. In the 1970s and 80s, the Outer Banks became a corridor for drug trafficking. Small planes and boats moving cocaine and marijuana from the Caribbean into the United States. What? The lighthouse, perched on the southern tip of the island, offered an unobstructed view of the surrounding waters. If someone was using the area for illegal operations, a lighthouse keeper who was documenting lights moving at 4 a.m. and footsteps in the tower could become a significant problem. But if Elias was killed, where was his body? The island was searched extensively. The waters were swept by Coast Guard boats and divers. The tidal patterns were analyzed. Bodies in water, even cold water, typically surface within days. But the ocean gave back nothing. Then, there was the witness. On the night of October 19th, a tourist named David Krantz was camping on the beach about 2 miles north of the lighthouse. Krantz was an experienced outdoorsman. He knew the island. He'd camped there multiple times. At approximately 4 a.m., he was woken by a sound. He described it later as a single, high-pitched cry, almost like a scream, but strangled, like it was cut off mid-breath. The sound came from the direction of the lighthouse. Krantz sat up and looked south. He could see the tower in the distance, a white column barely visible against the dark sky. The light was still burning at that point. He remembered the beam sweeping across the dunes. He listened for several minutes, heard nothing else, assumed it was an animal, went back to sleep. When investigators interviewed him days later, Krantz was certain of 3 things. The time was 4 a.m., the direction was the lighthouse, and the sound was human. But no one else reported hearing anything that night. The lighthouse station sits in a landscape that feels both open and suffocating. The tower itself is stark, a white column rising against the gray-blue expanse of the Atlantic. The keeper's walk at the top is a narrow iron railing that circles the lantern room, exposed to the wind, offering a dizzying view of the flat, wind-swept island below. The surrounding terrain is deceptive. During the day, it looks benign. Low scrub brush, beach grass, sand dunes rolling gently toward the water. But at night, it transforms. The dunes become disorienting. The sand shifts underfoot. Everything looks the same. It's easy to lose direction. Beyond the dunes, the land transitions to maritime forest, gnarled oak trees, and thick palmetto undergrowth that creates an impenetrable wall. The air inside is still and heavy. The ground is soft, damp, covered in decades of decomposing organic matter. And then there's the marsh, a vast expanse of brackish water and mud that stretches toward Pamlico Sound. At high tide, it's submerged. At low tide, it's a maze of narrow channels and sucking mud that can trap a man in minutes. This is where Elias Thorne disappeared. And this is where the environment consumed all evidence of what happened to him. The official conclusion, issued in 1986, was death by misadventure. The report suggested Elias had suffered a psychological break and likely wandered into the marsh or drowned in the ocean during the night of October 19th or early morning of October 20th. But the report couldn't explain several things. It couldn't explain why Elias took his rain slicker but nothing else. It couldn't explain why the lighthouse lamp had been manually extinguished, a deliberate process requiring knowledge and effort. It couldn't explain the cry David Krantz heard at 4 a.m. And it couldn't explain why, if Elias had simply wandered off in confusion, his body was never recovered despite immediate and extensive searches. The Coast Guard reviewed Elias's mental health records. They interviewed his family. They searched for financial problems, debts, reasons to disappear intentionally. They found nothing. Elias had no history of mental illness. He was stable, content. His family described him as quiet, reliable, someone who genuinely enjoyed the solitude of lighthouse work. But he was gone. At this point, you're likely asking, if someone was on that island, if the footsteps and lights were real, how did they get there? The answer is, it wouldn't have been difficult. Ocracoke is isolated, but it's not inaccessible. Small boats move through the waters around the island constantly. The coastline has dozens of small inlets and landing points. Someone familiar with the area could have reached the lighthouse station by water, approached under cover of darkness, and left the same way, all without being seen. The fog that night wasn't heavy, but visibility was limited. The lighthouse beam sweeps in a predictable pattern. Someone watching from the water would have known exactly when the light would be pointing away, when the darkness would provide cover. If Elias confronted someone, If he went to investigate the footsteps one last time, the isolation guaranteed no one would hear. No one would see. And the water guaranteed no one would find the body. In 2003, a journalist researching the case interviewed several longtime Ocracoke residents. Most refused to comment. One elderly woman who'd lived on the island her entire life agreed to speak but wouldn't allow her name to be used. She said, "The ocean takes what it wants. And sometimes the island does too. You all know that. You don't ask questions about what happens out there at night. You just accept it." When the journalist pressed, asked what she meant, asked if she thought someone had harmed Elias, the woman ended the interview. But before she left, she said one more thing. "There's people who use these waters, always have been. And they don't like being seen." So what happened to Elias Thorne? The forensic reality is this. He documented escalating signs of intrusion for 3 weeks. He heard footsteps. He saw lights. He noted evidence of someone entering the station. Then, on the night of October 19th, he disappeared. A witness heard a cry at 4 a.m. The lighthouse was found dark. His body was never recovered. The alternative explanations require believing that Elias suffered a sudden total psychological collapse despite showing no prior signs of mental illness, that he took only his rain slicker for reasons unknown, that he manually extinguished the lighthouse lamp before wandering into the terrain, and that his body was consumed so completely by the environment that 5 days of intensive searching found. Or you believe that someone was on that island, that the footsteps were real, that Elias, in trying to find out what's happening, encountered something, or someone he wasn't supposed to, and that the cry David Krantz heard at 4:00 a.m. wasn't the sound of a man having a breakdown. It was the sound of a man being silenced. The case remains unsolved. Elias Thorne is presumed dead. But the Ocracoke light still burns every night, sweeping its beam across the dunes and the dark water, and the keeper's quarters remain empty, as if waiting for someone to return. The unwritten rule of the waterfront: silence and corruption in the main port. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes, but everyone saw it. It was August 14th, 2001, mid-afternoon, at the Portland, Maine fish market. A long, low, open-air structure on the waterfront where boats offload their catch and workers process fish under harsh fluorescent lights. The floor is always wet. The air always smells like brine and diesel. And at 3:30 p.m. on a weekday, the place is crowded. Walter Higgins, the dockmaster, was holding a clipboard and gesturing toward the docks. His voice was raised. His body language was aggressive. Across from him stood Vincent Carbone, a man who wasn't a fisherman, wasn't a boat owner, but had more influence on the Portland waterfront than almost anyone else. Carbone leaned in close. His voice was low, intense. The workers nearby couldn't hear the words, but they understood the tone. This wasn't a disagreement about berth assignments. This was a warning. The exchange ended abruptly. Walter turned and walked away, heading toward the old Port District, the historic section of Portland with its narrow cobblestone streets and colonial-era brick buildings. He was seen walking into an alleyway between 2 warehouses at approximately 3:45 p.m. Walter Higgins was never seen again. His truck was found the next morning in a public parking lot near the waterfront. Keys in the ignition. Wallet in the center console with over $100 cash. Phone on the passenger seat. But Walter was gone. The investigation moved fast. Police interviewed Carbone within hours. He claimed the confrontation was a misunderstanding over dock operations. He said they'd parted on civil terms. He provided an alibi, said he'd been at a local bar with associates from 4 p.m. onward. Multiple witnesses corroborated the alibi. All of them were known associates of Carbone. All of them were part of the same entrenched waterfront network that had controlled the Portland docks for generations. Then the other witnesses, the ones who'd seen the confrontation at the fish market, started changing their stories. At first, several workers gave detailed statements. They described the heated exchange. They said Walter had seemed angry, agitated. One deckhand specifically recalled hearing Carbone say, "You don't know what you're getting into." But when police followed up 2 days later, the same witnesses claimed they'd been mistaken. The confrontation hadn't been that serious. Walter hadn't seemed angry. It was just a normal disagreement. Nothing unusual. The deckhand who'd heard Carbone's warning, he suddenly didn't remember the details. Said he'd misheard. Said he didn't want to get involved. One by one, the witnesses recanted or went silent. Not because they were lying the first time, because they understood something the investigators didn't. The Portland waterfront operates on rules that have nothing to do with law enforcement. This is a community where the same families have worked the docks for generations, where business is conducted on handshakes, where outsiders are tolerated but never trusted, and where the most important rule, the one that keeps you safe, keeps you employed, keeps you alive, is simple. You don't see anything. You don't say anything. Walter Higgins had worked the docks for 11 years as dock master. He understood the culture. He knew when to look the other way. He knew what questions not to ask. But in the summer of 2001, something pushed him past that boundary. He'd started questioning irregularities in shipping manifest. Discrepancies between what was logged as arriving and what was actually offloaded from certain vessels. Small inconsistencies. A few extra crates, unlisted containers. The kind of thing most people wouldn't notice. But Walter noticed. And in a place like Portland, noticing the wrong thing is dangerous. The lead detective on the case, a veteran named Martin Caruso, knew exactly what he was dealing with. In a 2005 interview, years after the investigation had stalled, Caruso said, "We had witnesses. We had statements. But every time we tried to follow up, the stories changed. People stopped returning calls. People who'd been cooperative suddenly couldn't remember details they'd given us days earlier. It was like the entire waterfront closed ranks. And once that happens, you're done. You can't build a case when no one will testify." This wasn't a case with no witnesses. This was a case where the witnesses collectively decided to stay silent. Because the unwritten rule of the waterfront is more powerful than any legal obligation. The fish market, where the confrontation occurred, is a specific kind of space. It's functional, not maintained. Corrugated metal roof. Open sides. Concrete floor stained dark from decades of fish blood and seawater. Industrial lights hang from the ceiling, casting harsh, unforgiving illumination across rows of stainless steel tables where workers gut, clean, and weigh the daily catch. The smell is overwhelming. Brine, diesel, fish, the faint metallic tang of blood. The air is cold and damp even in summer because the space is open to the water and the wind that constantly whips off the harbor. At 3:30 p.m., the market is busy, chaotic, public, which is why the confrontation was witnessed by so many people, and why the subsequent silence is so damning. The alleyway where Walter was last seen is narrow, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The cobblestones are uneven, slick with moisture. Dark dumpsters line the sides, overflowing, creating deep shadows even in daylight. The alley connects the waterfront to the main commercial streets of the old port. It's a shortcut. People use it constantly. But at 4 p.m. on August 14th, 21, no one reported seeing Walter Higgins walk through. The alley empties onto a busy street, shops, restaurants, pedestrians everywhere. Walter should have emerged within 2 minutes of entering the alley, but he didn't. Which means he either stopped somewhere inside the alley, voluntarily or otherwise, or he never made it to the other end. The harbor water at Portland is deep and murky. The docks are built on massive timber pilings driven into the harbor floor. Visibility below the surface is near zero. The tides in Casco Bay are strong. They can move a body miles in a matter of hours. If Walter was thrown into the water, recovery would have been almost impossible without knowing the exact location. Divers were deployed. They searched for days. Found nothing. But then something unexpected surfaced. In 2003, a retired fisherman named Gerald Poole came forward with information. Poole had worked the New Bedford docks for years and had later moved to Portland. He knew both communities. He knew how they operated. Poole gave a statement to investigators in which he made a pointed remark. Walter wasn't the first dockmaster to ask questions, and he wasn't the first to disappear. The waterfront has rules. You follow them, or you don't last. When pressed for details, Poole refused to elaborate. But his statement prompted investigators to review older cases. They found a pattern. In 1987, a dock supervisor named Thomas Riley had gone missing under similar circumstances. He'd been questioning irregularities in cargo manifests. He'd gotten into a public argument with a waterfront figure. His body was never found. In 1993, a harbor master's assistant named Carl Voss had disappeared after reporting suspected smuggling activity to authorities. His truck was found abandoned. No body was recovered. 1998, a customs inspector named Angela Moretti had been found dead in the water near the commercial docks. The official ruling was accidental drowning, but her family always maintained she was an excellent swimmer and had no reason to be near the water at night. 3 cases. 3 people who asked questions. 3 unsolved disappearances or suspicious deaths. And now, Walter Higgins made 4. The pattern was undeniable. But without physical evidence, without witnesses willing to testify, the cases remained cold. Vincent Carbone was never charged. He continued operating on the Portland waterfront for years, maintaining his position as a powerful, influential figure in the local establishment. He died in 2019 of natural causes. But before he died, he gave an interview to a maritime historian working on a book about the Portland docks. When asked about Walter Higgins, Carbone said, "Walter was a good man, but he didn't understand how things work. The waterfront isn't a place for idealists. It's a place for people who understand that sometimes you have to accept things the way they are. Walter couldn't do that. And that's a shame." The historian asked if Carbone knew what happened to Walter. Carbone's response, "I know the water is deep. And I know the people who work the docks take care of their own. Beyond that, I can't help." In 2008, a journalist attempted to investigate the case for a true crime podcast. She contacted over 20 people who'd worked on the Portland docks in 2001. Only 3 agreed to be interviewed. All 3 spoke off the record. All 3 said the same thing. "We don't talk about that. It's not safe." When asked what they meant by not safe, none of them would clarify. One of them, an older man who'd worked the docks for over 30 years, said something the journalist never forgot. "You think the law protects you? It doesn't. Not here. The waterfront protects its own. And if you're not one of its own, you're nobody." Walter forgot that. He thought being right mattered. It doesn't. Staying quiet. So what happened to Walter Higgins? The forensic reality is straightforward. He confronted a powerful figure about manifest irregularities. He was last seen walking into an alley near the waterfront. His body was never recovered. The most plausible scenario is that Walter was killed quickly, efficiently, and his body was disposed of in the harbor. The method suggests experience. The timing suggests coordination. The silence suggests collective complicity. But proving it requires witnesses. And in Portland, on the waterfront, witnesses don't exist. Because the unwritten rule isn't just about self-preservation. It's about community survival. The docks are controlled by networks that go back generations. Families, alliances, dependencies. You don't break those bonds. You don't challenge that power. And you certainly don't testify against it. Walter Higgins broke the rule. He asked questions he shouldn't have asked. He challenged people he shouldn't have challenged. He believed that doing the right thing mattered more than staying silent. And the waterfront made sure no one would make that mistake again. The case remains opened. Walter Higgins is presumed dead. But the docks are still there. The same boats, the same workers, the same rules, and the same silence. The cry from the keeper's walk. The missing keeper of Anastasia Island. The journal entry was desperate. I'm going to stay awake tonight. I'm going to find out what's happening. I have to know. That was July 21st, 1978. Iowa. The final words written by Leo Quinn, a lighthouse attendant at the St. Augustine Lighthouse on Anastasia Island, Florida. By the morning of July 22nd, Leo was gone. The lighthouse lamp was still burning. The door to the keeper's house was open. Leo's wallet, keys, and identification were on the dresser. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the kitchen counter. But Leo had vanished. And the door leading to the keeper's walk, the narrow iron walkway, at the top of the 165-foot tower, was unlatched, swinging slightly in the humid breeze. The St. Augustine Lighthouse is not a comfortable place to work alone. The tower is striking during the day. Black and white spirals rising against the subtropical sky, visible for miles. But at night, it transforms. The surrounding scrub becomes a wall of darkness. The dense palmetto thickets and gnarled oak trees create an impenetrable maze of shadow. The only light comes from the rotating beam at the top of the tower, sweeping across the landscape in a slow, methodical rhythm. Leo had been working at the lighthouse for 8 months. He lived alone in the keeper's quarters. His job was to maintain the lamp, conduct tours, ensure the light operated continuously. For the first few months, everything was normal. Then the footsteps started. Leo kept a personal journal. After his disappearance, investigators found it in his apartment. The early entries were routine: complaints about the heat, notes about tourists, maintenance logs. But starting in late June, the tone changed. June 24th. I keep hearing footsteps on the spiral staircase at night. I go to check. No one is ever there. The door is locked. I'm the only one with a key, but I hear them. Clear as day. Footsteps. Climbing. July 2nd, the footsteps again. This time, they went all the way to the top. I heard them on the keeper's walk, the iron walkway around the lantern room. I went up immediately. Nothing. Just the wind. But the wind doesn't sound like boots on metal. July 9th, I saw a light last night. Around 3 a.m. Outside my window. Too high to be a person on the ground. Too low to be a boat signal. It moves slowly, like someone walking with a lantern. But there's no walkway there. Nothing. Just air in the tower. I went outside. The light was gone. The entries escalated. July 18th. I think someone is coming onto the property at night. I don't know how. I don't know why. But I feel watched. I hear things. I see things. I'm not crazy. I'm not imagining this. Something is wrong. And then, the final entry. July 21st. I'm going to stay awake tonight. I'm going to find out what's happening. I have to know. Leo Quinn disappeared that night. At approximately 4 a.m. on July 22nd, a man named Richard Alvarez was camping on the beach about half a mile south of the lighthouse. He was with his girlfriend. The night was warm. The ocean was calm. Alvarez was woken by a sound he would later describe to investigators as unmistakable. A single high-pitched cry, almost a scream, but strangled, like someone was being choked or falling. The sound came from the direction of the lighthouse. Alvarez sat up, looked north. He could see the tower in the distance, the rotating beams sweeping across the dark sky. He listened for several minutes. Nothing else. He assumed it was an animal. Went back to sleep. When investigators interviewed him days later, Alvarez was certain of three things. The time was 4:00 a.m. The direction was the lighthouse. And the sound was human. No one else reported hearing anything that night. The investigation faced two competing theories. The first, psychological breakdown. Leo's journal clearly documented escalating paranoia. Isolation does brutal things to the mind, especially in postings like this, where you're alone for weeks, surrounded by darkness, hearing every creak and groan of an old structure magnified by silence. If Leo had suffered a mental collapse, he might have climbed to the top of the tower in the middle of the night, gone out onto the keeper's walk, and either jumped or fallen. The keeper's walk is narrow, less than 3 feet wide, with a low railing. A disoriented, panicked person could easily lose balance. But there was a critical problem with this theory. If Leo had fallen from the keeper's walk, his body would have been at the base of the tower. It's a 165-foot drop onto concrete and packed sand. A body doesn't fall from that height and disappear. Investigators searched the area extensively. The base of the tower, the surrounding scrub, the beach, the marshland behind the keeper's house. Nothing. The second theory was darker, but harder to dismiss. What if the footsteps weren't hallucinations? Anastasia Island, despite its proximity to St. Augustine, has long stretches of undeveloped land. The lighthouse sits on one of those stretches, surrounded by dense vegetation that offers easy cover for approach and retreat. In the 1970s, the Florida coast was a major route for drug smuggling. Small planes, boats, remote beaches, isolated landing sites. The St. Augustine Lighthouse, with its elevated position and 360-degree view, would have been a perfect lookout point. If someone was using the area for illegal activity, a lighthouse attendant documenting lights moving at 3 a.m. and footsteps in the tower would be a problem that needed to be solved. But if Leo was killed, where was his body? The surrounding waters were searched. The marshland was combed. The tidal patterns were analyzed. Nothing. The terrain around the lighthouse is deceptive. During the day, it's beautiful subtropical vegetation. Live oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly to the east. But at night, the environment becomes hostile. The scrub is dense and impenetrable. Palmetto thickets grow thick and low, creating walls of spiny vegetation. The oak trees spread twisted branches overhead, blocking moonlight, creating pockets of absolute darkness. The ground is soft and damp, covered in decades of decomposing leaves. The air is heavy, thick with moisture and the smell of salt and decay. The light from the tower sweeps across the landscape every few seconds, illuminating patches of vegetation briefly before plunging them back into darkness. It's disorienting. It creates the illusion of movement where there is none. And the keeper's walk at the top of the tower is exposed, dizzying, surrounded by nothing but air and the black scrub below. This is where Leo Quinn was heading when he decided to find out what's happening. And this is where he disappeared. The official conclusion, issued in 1979, was death by misadventure. The report suggested Leo had suffered a psychological break, likely due to isolation-induced stress, and had either fallen from the tower or wandered into the marshland during the night of July 21st. But the report couldn't explain several critical details. It couldn't explain the unlatched door to the keeper's walk. It couldn't explain the cry Richard Alvarez heard at 4 a.m. It couldn't explain why, if Leo had fallen or wandered off, his body was never found despite extensive searches. Investigators reviewed Leo's background. No history of mental illness. Financially stable. No debts. No enemies. His family described him as introverted, but not depressed. Content with his work. But he was gone. You might wonder why this case continues to disturb the people familiar with it. The answer is the journal. Leo's entries weren't the incoherent ravings of someone losing their mind. They were detailed, lucid, methodical. They read like the observations of someone trying to document evidence, trying to prove, to himself or to others, that what he was experiencing was real. And that raises a question. What if Leo wasn't wrong? What if someone was on the property at night? What if the footsteps were real? What if the lights were real? What if Leo, in his determination to find out, confronted someone he shouldn't have? If that's true, then the cry Richard Alvarez heard at 4:00 a.m. wasn't the sound of a man having a psychological break. It was the sound of a man being killed. The St. Augustine Lighthouse is still operational. It's now a museum and tourist attraction. The keeper's house has been renovated. The tower is open for tours. Visitors can climb the 219 steps and stand on the keeper's walk, looking out over the same landscape Leo Quinn saw every night. But the people who work there don't talk about Leo Quinn. In 1995, a journalist researching the case interviewed several longtime staff members. Most declined to comment. One woman, who'd worked at the lighthouse for over a decade, agreed to speak, but wouldn't allow her name to be used. She said, "Strange things happen here at night. We've all heard things we can't explain. We've all seen lights. Most of us just ignore it. But every now and then someone starts paying too much attention. And that's when things go wrong." When pressed, she ended the interview. But before leaving, she added, "If you're smart, you don't ask questions. You just do your job and you leave." So, what happened to Leo Quinn? The forensic reality is this. He documented 3 weeks of escalating disturbances. He heard footsteps. He saw lights. He noted evidence of intrusion. Then, on the night, he decided to stay awake and find out. He disappeared. A witness heard a cry at 4 a.m. The door to the keeper's walk was found unlatched. His body was never recovered. The alternative requires believing Leo suffered a sudden, complete psychological collapse, despite showing no prior signs. That he fell or wandered off in a way that left no trace, and that 5 days of intensive searching failed to locate any evidence. Or you believe the footsteps were real. The lights were real. And Leo, in trying to confront whatever, or whoever, was on that property, encountered something that couldn't allow him to live. The case remains unsolved. Leo Quinn is presumed dead. But at the St. Augustine Lighthouse, the light still burns every night. And sometimes, late at night, the staff still hear footsteps on the spiral staircase, climbing. The investigative failure in Astoria. The shoe print was perfect. Size 11. Deep tread pattern. Pressed into the soft, wet mud at the edge of the salt marsh, less than 20 feet from where Clara Jensen's car had been found, abandoned on the wetland road outside Astoria, Oregon. It was October 12, 2004. The print didn't match Clara's shoes. It didn't match any of the search team's boots. It was fresh, made within hours of the car being discovered, which meant someone else had been there. Someone who might have seen what happened to Clara, or someone who made something happen to Clara. The forensic team photographed the print. They measured it. They documented the exact location. They prepared to make a cast, the standard procedure for preserving footprint evidence. And then the rain started. The Pacific Northwest doesn't do rain the way other places do rain. It doesn't come in sudden downpours that clear quickly. It comes as a constant, fine, soaking mist that settles over everything and never stops. It seeps into the ground. It fills the air. It erases. Within 2 hours, the shoe print was gone. Not faded, not degraded. Gone. The mud had turned to slurry. The tread pattern had dissolved. The edges had blurred and collapsed. And then the tide came in, because this wasn't just rain and mud. This was a tidal salt marsh, and high tide was approaching. By the time the forensic team returned the next morning with equipment to search the area more thoroughly, the entire section of ground where the print had been was underwater. The marsh had claimed it. The only evidence that might have led investigators to Clara Jensen, or to whoever had been with her, was erased by the environment itself. Clara was 28 years old. She was a graduate student at Portland State University, studying wetland ecology. She knew the terrain. She'd spent months conducting fieldwork in the salt marshes around Astoria as part of her thesis research. On the morning of October 11th, 2004, Clara drove from Portland to Astoria to collect water samples from the marshland along the Youngs River. She'd made the drive dozens of times. She knew the roads. She knew the risks. She called her advisor at 10:15 a.m. to confirm she'd arrived safely. She said she'd be working near the wetland access road for a few hours and would check in again by early afternoon. She never called. By 6:00 p.m., when Clara hadn't returned any calls or texts, her roommate contacted the university. The university contacted local authorities. A search was launched immediately. Clara's car, a dark blue Honda Civic, was found at 8:30 p.m., parked on the shoulder of the wetland road, approximately 3 miles outside Astoria. The car was unlocked. Her backpack was on the passenger seat, containing her laptop, wallet, phone, and field research equipment. The driver's side door was open, but Clara was gone. The wetland road is a narrow, elevated strip of asphalt built on fill, cutting through the vast expanse of the Youngs River salt marsh. On both sides of the road, the land drops steeply into soft, muddy channels of slow-moving tidal water and dense grasses that stretch for miles. The marsh is flat, open, and perpetually gray. Low clouds hang just above the surface, trapped by the cold air rising from the water. The mist is so thick you can barely see 100 feet in any direction. The only sounds are the wind moving through the grasses and the occasional cry of a heron or gull. It's beautiful in a desolate, lonely way. And it's treacherous. The ground looks solid but isn't. The channels that cut through the grasses can be waist deep. The mud can trap you in seconds. The tide comes in fast and silent, turning walkable ground into submerged waterways in less than an hour. This is where Clara Jensen was last seen, and this is where the investigation collapsed. The shoe print was discovered the next morning, October 12th, by a deputy conducting a grid search of the area immediately surrounding Clara's car. The print was on the marsh side of the road, approximately 15 feet down the muddy embankment that slopes from the asphalt into the wetland. The print was facing away from the road, as if someone had been walking from the car toward the marsh. But here's what made it critical. The print was too large to be Clara's. Clara wore a size 7. This print was a size 11, possibly 12. The tread pattern suggested a hiking boot or work boot, common in the area, but distinct enough to potentially match to a specific brand or owner. If investigators could preserve the print, they could compare it to boots owned by anyone who became a suspect. They could narrow the field. They could build a case. But they needed time. And the environment didn't give them time. The rain started at approximately 11:00 a.m. By 11:30 a.m., the print was visibly degrading. By 1:00 p.m., it was unrecognizable. By 3:00 p.m., when high tide reached the area, the entire section of embankment was submerged under 2 feet of brackish water. The forensic team, comprised of local deputies and a single evidence technician from the Oregon State Police, had been under-equipped from the start. They didn't have portable casting materials on site. They didn't have immediate access to a wetland forensic specialist. They didn't have a protocol for preserving evidence in a tidal environment. By the time they realized the urgency, it was too late. The lead investigator on the case, a Clatsop County Sheriff's detective named Michael Draven, later said in an interview, "We knew we had something. We knew that print mattered. But we were working in conditions that were actively destroying evidence faster than we could document it. The rain, the tide, the mud, it all conspired against us, and we didn't have the resources or the expertise to fight it." It wasn't negligence. It was reality. Small-town law enforcement agencies in rural Oregon don't have wetland forensics teams on standby. They don't have million-dollar budgets for environmental evidence preservation. They do the best they can with what they have. And in this case, what they had wasn't enough. The search for Clara lasted 6 days. Teams combed the salt marsh on foot, wading through the channels, searching the grasses, probing the mud. Helicopters swept overhead, using thermal imaging to try to detect body heat. Cadaver dogs were brought in, though their effectiveness in waterlogged environments is limited. The search covered over 15 square miles of marshland. They found nothing. No body. No clothing. No signs of struggle. No evidence that Clara had ever left the road, except for the shoe print that no longer existed. The investigators tried to reconstruct Clara's movements. Her car had been found with the driver's side door open. Her belongings were inside. There were no signs of a struggle in or around the vehicle. The keys were in the ignition. The most straightforward theory was that Clara had pulled over for some reason. Maybe she'd seen something in the marsh worth documenting. Maybe she'd needed to adjust her equipment and had stepped out of the car. But why would she walk down the embankment into the marsh? She was an experienced ecologist. She knew the dangers. She knew the tides. She wouldn't have wandered into unstable terrain without her gear, without her phone, without telling anyone, unless she wasn't alone. The shoe print suggested a second person had been present. Someone wearing size 11 or 12 boots. Someone who'd walked from the direction of Clara's car down toward the marsh. But who? The wetland road is lightly traveled. It's used mostly by researchers, bird watchers, and the occasional local fisherman. It's not a commuter route. It's not a place you end up by accident. Investigators canvassed the area. They interviewed everyone who lived within 5 miles. They checked for any reports of suspicious vehicles or individuals in the days leading up to Clara's disappearance. They found nothing actionable. One local man, a fisherman who used the wetland road regularly, mentioned that he'd seen an unfamiliar pickup truck parked on the shoulder near the marsh about a week before Clara disappeared. He couldn't remember the make or model. He didn't get a plate number. He didn't see anyone near the truck. It was a lead that went nowhere. Then there was the phone call. On October 11th, the day Clara disappeared, her phone registered a single outgoing call at 11:47 a.m. The call lasted 14 seconds. It was placed to her roommate's number. But her roommate never received the call. It didn't show up in her call log. It didn't go to voicemail. It was as if the call had been placed, but never connected. Cell phone records confirmed the call was made, but there was no record of it completing. Investigators consulted with the phone carrier. The explanation was technical and unsatisfying. The call had likely been dropped due to poor signal strength in the marsh area. The phone had initiated the connection, but the signal had failed before the call could route through the network. which meant Clara had tried to call for help. Or tried to call someone. But the environment, the remoteness, the poor coverage, the interference from the terrain had prevented the call from going through. It was another piece of evidence consumed by the landscape. The Astoria area is notorious for its weather. This isn't the occasional rainstorm. This is constant, unrelenting moisture. Gray skies that last for weeks. Fog that rolls in from the Pacific and settles over the land like a wet blanket. The salt marsh itself is a hostile environment for evidence preservation. The ground is saturated. The tidal water is brackish, part freshwater from the river, part saltwater from the ocean, and it's constantly moving, constantly churning. Anything left in the marsh degrades rapidly. Organic material decomposes. Fabric disintegrates. Even bone can be scattered and buried by the shifting sediment. If Clara's body ended up in the marsh, whether by accident, misadventure, or foul play, it's entirely possible it was consumed by the environment within days. The tides move in and out twice a day. The channels shift. The mud settles and reforms. A body could be buried under inches of sediment and never be found, even with ground-penetrating radar. But then something unexpected surfaced. In 2006, 2 years after Clara disappeared, a hiker found a piece of waterproof fabric snagged on a branch in the marsh about a mile downstream from where Clara's car had been located. The fabric was dark blue, heavily degraded, but still identifiable as part of her rain jacket. The hiker reported the find to local authorities. The fabric was collected and sent for analysis. DNA testing was inconclusive. The sample was too degraded, but the fabric was consistent with the type of rain jacket Clara had been known to wear. Her roommate confirmed that Clara owned a dark blue waterproof jacket and that it hadn't been found in her apartment or her car. But one piece of fabric, found 2 years later, a mile away, proves nothing. It could have been Clara's. It could have belonged to anyone. The marsh is used by dozens of people, researchers, fishermen, bird watchers. Jackets get lost. Fabric gets snagged. It was a potential lead that couldn't be confirmed. The investigation into Clara Jensen's disappearance remains open. But it has been effectively cold since 2005. Detective Draven, who led the initial investigation, retired in 2011. In a final interview before leaving the department, he said, "The environment won as much as anything else. We had a witness, that shoe print. We had a timeline. We had a location. But the rain, the tide, the marsh itself, it destroyed everything faster than we could preserve it. If we'd had another 6 hours, if the tide had been lower, if the rain had held off, we might have had enough. But we didn't. And Clara's family has had to live with that." Clara's mother, Margaret Jensen, has given multiple interviews over the years. She's never accepted the theory that Clara simply wandered into the marsh and drowned. In a 2010 interview, she said, "My daughter knew that marsh better than anyone. She'd spent months there. She knew the tides. She knew the terrain. She wouldn't have walked into danger. Someone was with her. Someone was with her. And that person knows what happened, but because the evidence was destroyed, that person has never been held accountable." At this point, you're likely asking, should Clara have simply slipped, fallen, and drowned in one of the deep channels? The answer is possibly. The marsh is dangerous. The channels are deceptive. The mud can trap you. The cold water can incapacitate you in minutes. Even an experienced researcher can make a fatal mistake. But several things don't fit that scenario. First, Clara's car was found with the door open and her belongings inside. If she'd been planning to go into the marsh, she would have taken her equipment. She would have locked her car. She would have told someone where she was going. Second, The shoe print. If Clara had slipped and fallen into a channel, who made the print? And why did that person not report seeing her or helping her? Third, the failed phone call. If Clara was in distress, if she was trying to call for help, it suggests she knew something was wrong. It suggests she had time to react. It suggests this wasn't a sudden accidental fall. The alternative theory, the one Clara's family has always believed, is that someone was with her. Someone who either caused her harm or witnessed her harm and chose not to report it. The shoe print supports this. The failed phone call supports this. The open car door supports this. But without the print, without physical evidence, without witnesses, there's no way to prove it. The case is haunted by a single, agonizing certainty. The evidence existed. It was there. It was documented. And then the environment destroyed it before it could be preserved. The wetland road outside Astoria is still there. The salt marsh still stretches for miles on both sides. Researchers still use the area for field work. The tides still come in twice a day. The rain still falls constantly. And somewhere in that vast gray expanse of water and mud and grass, the answer to what happened to Clara Jensen might still exist. But the marsh isn't giving it back. Because this case isn't just about a missing person. It's about the brutal reality that sometimes the environment itself becomes the accomplice. The rain erases. The tide conceals. The mud consumes. And the system, understaffed, under-resourced, under-equipped, can't fight back. Clara Jensen disappeared on October 11th, 2004. Her body has never been found. The shoe print that might have led to answers was destroyed within hours of its discovery. And the marsh, the cold, gray, unforgiving marsh, keeps its secrets. The empty bunk of the seeker, the unresolved grief of Kodiak. The bunk was still warm. That's what Toby Svensson's father said when he returned to the boat. The boy had been asleep less than an hour earlier. The wool blanket was pulled back, halfway off the mattress, as if Toby had gotten up quickly. The small pillow still held the indent of his head. But Toby was gone. It was December 3rd, 1999. The temperature in Kodiak, Alaska was 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The harbor was dark, the water black and edged with ice. The commercial fishing vessel, the Seeker, was tied securely at its winter berth, one of dozens of boats lined up along the wharf, their hulls coated in frost, their decks slick with frozen spray. Toby's father, Eric Svensson, had left the boat at 10:00 p.m. to walk to the nearby marine supply store for fuel additives and engine parts. The trip was short, less than half a mile. He expected to be gone 45 minutes at most. He returned at 10:47 p.m. Toby, his 12-year-old son, was gone. The cabin of the Seeker is small, cramped, and warm, insulated against the brutal Alaskan cold. It's a working boat, not a pleasure craft. The interior is functional. 2 narrow bunks, a compact galley, a single porthole window that fogs over in winter. When Eric left, Toby had been asleep in the lower bunk, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The cabin door was closed but not locked. There's no reason to lock a door on your own boat in a secure harbor. The deck door leading outside was secured with a simple latch. When Eric returned, the cabin door was still closed. But the deck door, the one leading outside onto the frozen dock, was unlatched. Not fully open, but not secured. And Toby was gone. The wool blanket that had been covering him was missing. Everything else, Toby's coat, his boots, his winter gloves, was still in the cabin. Eric Svensson began searching immediately. He checked the other boats moored nearby. He walked the length of the wharf, calling Toby's name. He checked the dockmaster's office, the supply store, The few businesses that were still open at that hour. Nothing. He contacted the harbor patrol at 11:15 p.m. on tow. Within 30 minutes, the search had expanded. Police arrived. Coast Guard units were alerted. The entire waterfront was searched, boat by boat, dock by dock. They found no sign of Toby Svensson. By 2:00 a.m., divers were deployed into the harbor water, searching the area around the seeker. The water was just above freezing. Visibility was near zero. The search was slow, methodical, and excruciating. They found nothing. The official theory, the one that appeared in the initial police report and has been repeated in every subsequent review, is that Toby woke up while his father was gone, became disoriented or curious, and went up onto the deck. In the dark, on the ice-slicked surface, he slipped and fell into the harbor. The theory suggests he drowned within minutes. The freezing water would have incapacitated him almost instantly. The shock alone could have prevented him from calling out. His body, according to the theory, was pulled under the dock by the current or trapped beneath one of the nearby boats. It's a plausible scenario. It's tragic, but it fits the facts. Except for one thing. Toby's father has never believed it. Erik Svensson has given only a handful of interviews over the years. He's a private man, a commercial fisherman who spent his entire adult life working the brutal waters off the Alaskan coast. He's not prone to speculation. He's not prone to emotion. But in a 2005 interview with a local newspaper, he said something that has haunted everyone who's familiar with the case. Toby would never have gone outside alone at night. Never. He knew the rules. He knew the danger. He was 12, but he'd been on boats his whole life. He knew you don't go on deck in the dark in winter without your father. He knew you don't go outside without your coat and boots. And even if he'd forgotten, even if he'd been confused or half asleep, it's a question no one has been able to answer. The Kodiak Harbor in winter is one of the most unforgiving environments on the North American coast. The docks are slick with ice. The massive fishing trawlers are lined up side by side, their hulls dark and imposing, their decks covered in snow and frost. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. The wind cuts through clothing like a blade. At night, the harbor is lit by weak, widely spaced streetlights that cast long shadows across the icy planks. The water is black, still, reflecting nothing. The only sounds are the creak of the boats shifting against their moorings and the occasional crack of ice forming along the edges of the dock. It's not a place a child would go voluntarily, especially not in the middle of the night, especially not without boots or a coat. But Toby went somewhere. The investigation focused on several possibilities. The first was accidental drowning, the theory Erik has never accepted. Investigators argued that Toby might have woken up disoriented, heard a noise outside, and gone to investigate. In his sleepy state, he grabbed the blanket for warmth and went out onto the deck. The ice caused him to slip. He fell into the water. The cold incapacitated him before he could call out. But the divers found nothing. The harbor floor was searched extensively. The area beneath the seeker and the surrounding boats was swept multiple times. If Toby had fallen in, his body should have been recoverable. Children's bodies, even in freezing water, typically remain near the site of drowning due to their smaller size and lower body fat. But the water gave back nothing. The second theory was abduction. Kodiak is a small community, but the harbor is active even in winter. Boats come and go. Workers move through at odd hours. Transient fishermen pass through regularly. If someone had been on the docks that night, someone who saw Toby alone on the boat, who saw an opportunity, it's possible the boy was taken. But there were problems with this theory too. First, the timing. Erik was gone for less than 47 minutes. For someone to have noticed Toby was alone, approached the boat, convinced or forced the boy to leave, and disappeared without being seen. All in under an hour, in a busy harbor, requires a level of speed and opportunity that's difficult to accept. Second, there were no reports of unfamiliar individuals in the area that night. The dockmaster's log showed no unusual vehicle activity. No boats left the harbor between 10:00 p.m. and midnight. Third, Kodiak is isolated. It's an island. The only way off is by boat or plane. If someone had taken Toby, where would they have gone? And why has no evidence ever surfaced? But then there's the blanket. The missing wool blanket has always been the detail that investigators can't explain. If Toby had simply slipped and fallen into the water, the blanket would have either fallen with him, in which case it might have been recovered. It would have been left on the deck, but it wasn't on the deck. It wasn't in the water. It was gone. If Toby had been abducted, why would he bring the blanket? Or why would an abductor take it? The only scenario that makes sense is that Toby left the boat wrapped in the blanket, either because he was cold, or because someone told him to bring it, or because he was trying to stay warm while going somewhere. But where? And with whom? In the weeks following Toby's disappearance, investigators interviewed over 60 people. Dock workers, boat crews, residents who lived near the harbor, anyone who might have seen or heard something on the night of December 3rd. Almost everyone said the same thing. They didn't see anything unusual. They didn't hear anything. The night was quiet, cold, normal. But one dock worker, a man named Carl Messer, who'd been working late that night offloading crab traps, told investigators he'd seen someone walking along the wharf around 10:30 p.m. He couldn't see details. The lighting was poor, and the figure was at a distance. But he remembered it because the person appeared to be wrapped in something dark and bulky, like a blanket or tarp. Messer assumed it was one of the transient workers or a fisherman heading back to a boat. He didn't think much of it at the time. When investigators followed up, Messer couldn't provide more details. He didn't see a face. He didn't see where the figure went. He didn't see anyone else with them. It was a potential lead that went nowhere. The search for Toby Svensson lasted 3 weeks. The harbor was searched repeatedly. The surrounding areas, the roads, the businesses, the residential neighborhoods were canvassed. Flyers were posted across the island. The Coast Guard conducted aerial searches of the coastline and the waters around Kodiak. Nothing. By early January 2000, the active search was suspended. The case remained open, but there were no new leads, no evidence, no witnesses. Toby Svensson was classified as a missing person, presumed dead, but his body has never been found. Eric Svensson continued working as a commercial fisherman for several more years, but he sold the Seeker in 2002. He couldn't go back to the boat, couldn't sleep in the cabin, couldn't look at the empty bunk. In 2008, he gave his final interview to a true crime journalist researching the case. He was asked if he believed Toby had drowned. His answer was quiet, but firm. No, I don't. Toby knew the water. He respected it. He feared it. He wouldn't have gone near the edge of that deck in the dark. Even if he slipped, his body would have been found. We searched for weeks. The divers went down again and again. They found nothing. You don't just disappear. The journalist asked what Eric believed had happened. Eric didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I think someone was on those docks. I think someone saw Toby alone. I think they took him. And I think they made sure no one would ever find him. That's what I think. But I can't prove it. And that's the worst part." The case of Toby Svensson is different from the others in one critical way. It's not about isolation or environmental destruction of evidence. It's about time. 47 minutes. That's how long Eric Svensson was gone. That's the window in which Toby disappeared. If Toby had fallen into the water by accident, his body should have been recoverable. If he'd wandered off on foot, someone should have seen him. If he'd been abducted, there should have been some evidence. Tire tracks, witnesses, something. But there's nothing. Just an empty bunk. A missing blanket. And a father who's spent the last 25 years living with a question that has no answer. Kodiak is a small island. The community is tight. People talk. Rumors spread. In the years following Toby's disappearance, there had been whispers, unsubstantiated theories, suggestions that someone local was involved, that someone knew more than they were saying, but no one has ever come forward. No one has ever been charged. No evidence has ever surfaced. In 2015, a private investigator hired by a family advocacy group reviewed the case. His conclusion was bleak. Without a body, without witnesses, without physical evidence, this case is unsolvable. The most likely scenario is that Toby Svensson drowned, and his body was never recovered due to the conditions in the harbor. But the details, the missing blanket, the unlatched door, the narrow time window, suggest the possibility of foul play. We'll likely never know for certain. So what happened to Toby Svensson? The forensic reality is this. He disappeared from a secured boat in less than 47 minutes. He left without his coat or boots, but took a wool blanket. The door to the deck was found unlatched. His body was never recovered despite extensive searches. A dock worker reported seeing a figure wrapped in something dark walking along the wharf around the time of the disappearance. The official theory is accidental drowning, but the evidence doesn't fully support it. The alternative, that someone was on those docks, that someone took Toby, that someone made sure he would never be found, is equally difficult to prove. What's left is grief, unresolved, unending. Eric Svensson still lives in Kodiak. He no longer fishes. He rarely speaks about Toby. But every December 3rd, he walks to the harbor. He stands at the end of the wharf where the Seeker used to be moored, and he looks out at the black water, waiting for an answer that will never come. 7 cases, 7 vanishings. 7 coastal towns where the ocean, the fog, and the isolation conspired to erase the truth. These aren't stories about monsters or ghosts. These are stories about the brutal, unforgiving reality of environments that don't preserve evidence. About communities that close ranks. About investigations that collapse under the weight of missing data, hostile terrain, and the passage of time. Mark Delaney walked into the darkness of a Gloucester parking lot and was never seen again. Sammy Kincaid was murdered in New Bedford, and the boat that might explain how the killer escaped exists in 2 places at once, according to witnesses who both passed polygraphs. Elias Thorne documented footsteps and lights at an isolated lighthouse, and then vanished, leaving only a cry in the night. Walter Higgins asked the wrong questions on the Portland docks, and the entire waterfront decided not to remember. Leo Quinn tried to find out what was happening at the St. Augustine Lighthouse, and disappeared from the top of a 165-foot tower. Clara Jensen's only witness, a shoe print, was destroyed by rain and tide before it could be preserved. And Toby Svensson, a 12-year-old boy, vanished from a locked boat in less than an hour, taking only a blanket. The truth, it seems, is still adrift, hidden beneath the shifting tides of forensic confusion. We've traced 7 cold trails tonight, from the icy berths of Kodiak to the silent docks of Gloucester. Yet in every case, the final piece of the puzzle remains just out of reach. We want to know what you see in the shadows of these coastal towns. Which piece of conflicting evidence, which anomaly, do you believe holds the key to the final logbook? Share your theory in the comments below. And if you want to join us every week as we navigate the chilling unknowns of the American landscape, ensure you are subscribed and the notification bell is on. This has been Plain Sight Docs. If you've heard something about these cases, if you know something that's never been said, the families are still waiting, because the sea may keep its secrets. But someone, somewhere, knows the truth.